This is episode 11 with entrepreneur and recruiting expert Phil Reeve.
You may know the destination, but do you know the path to take you there? This is Profits to Wealth. We shorten the time it takes for entrepreneurs to find true success through guided conversations alongside industry elites. We'll cover your commonly asked questions and dive into the skills, tactics, and lessons learned from business professionals who've turned the industry on its head through experience, critical thinking, as well as practical money management. It's time to talk business, money, and freedom with your host, Jack Marino Jr.
John Rockefeller Jr. said, "The secret of success is to do the common thing uncommonly well." Welcome to Profits to Wealth. This is your host, Jack Marino Jr. Today on the show, I'll be interviewing Phil Reeve. Phil is the head recruiter for Reeve Associates, a staffing and recruiting firm he founded in 1997. Phil and his team in Austin, Texas, provide unique recruiting solutions for employers across the United States, helping those employers to not only attract, but retain top talent while freeing up both time and money for owners. In this episode, Phil discusses his own entrepreneurial journey and what makes his company different than the other recruiting solutions in the marketplace. He discusses common mistakes made by most business owners during the hiring process and what changes they should make to yield a better result. Phil also discusses how listeners can better use social media to find top talent and what they can do to get more offers accepted by their ideal candidates. Be sure to stay tuned to the end where Phil shares valuable recruiting resources and how listeners can contact him directly for help. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me on.
I'm excited about this topic because this is, as we record this, very timely for Lake Hills Wealth Management because we've hired several team members in the last quarter, and I know the pains of hiring firsthand, and I know that we're not alone in that. So I'm excited to hear from your perspective what entrepreneurs can do to make that process better or more enjoyable. So before we get into that, I'm always interested to learn more about each entrepreneur's journey in that, how did they decide to actually become an entrepreneur? A lot of times we start out in the corporate world as an employee, then for one reason or the other, we actually say, you know what, I want to do my own thing for whatever reason. And then there's some cases where the individual just starts out as an entrepreneur. So what is your story? How'd you start your entrepreneurial journey?
All very good questions. And I think this podcast, recording it now in January, is very timely for this time of year because this is when people start thinking about hiring or looking for new jobs. So hopefully the timing will benefit everybody as we move into a new year and a new decade.
I agree.
As far as my entrepreneurial journey, I was going to talk about how I got into recruiting, but it's interesting thinking and reflecting upon it. I think I was always an entrepreneur. I literally was the kid that delivered newspapers, and then I took on everybody else's route until I had 5 different routes running because I liked running my own business. So I think my struggle was even in college when I had little jobs, I still did my own landscaping and things like that because the flexibility and obviously you could earn more and make decisive decisions about things that would happen. So I started working for Nielsen Media for a short time when I first graduated college, and then a video production company for a short time, and ended up at a recruiting firm after that. And during that time, I really had no intentions on starting my own business, but in the short time that I was there, about 2 years at a recruiting company, I saw the ebb and flow of employees come and go and how the system was broken. And I couldn't fix it because whoever was running it wasn't making good decisions. So ultimately I said, well, I can live on peanut butter and jelly and drive a pickup truck and do this at 27. Now is the time to do it versus having kids and a family and not being able to do it.
So you had that, you sound like your story sounds a lot like mine, always looking for ways to make money, even at a young age. And So you did have some experience, a couple years with a bigger firm, kind of cut your teeth there, and then you decided to look, hey, I'm going to do my own thing because I'm used to this. This was sort of that spirit that was inside of you. And plus, I guess what pushed you out was that from the operational side, you felt like you could maybe tweak it or do something different that would overall make the business better, right?
Yes, was the whole plan. And of course, that wasn't my initial idea. It's a very scary thing to say, hey, I'm going to start my own company and I have no money. I don't know what I'm doing. But I went and interviewed at a few other companies and I realized it was just more of the same. And I'm like, I can't do this. Let's give it a whirl. If it fails, what does it matter? I can always go work somewhere else.
Right. At that point, you probably had not as much to lose, right? When you're young, you don't, like you said, you didn't have family and a lot of assets and things like that. So, and plus, I think it's key that you've already, had other businesses. So you kind of knew what it was like to start from zero, so I think that you're either an entrepreneur or you're not. And I have these conversations with my wife. She doesn't understand that spirit. She likes getting that constant paycheck, knowing that no matter what, I'm going to get this paycheck and I get these holidays off. When you're a business owner, there is no such thing as quote unquote paid time off, right? Everything is, you are the business, especially when you start out. Now, later in the cycle of the business, depending on what your goals are, you can actually scale it. So, but anyway, so you went out on your own and you formed Reeve Associates?
Correct. Yep.
So tell us more about your company, what you specialize in, what services, things like that.
So we're a recruiting company. There's two different traditional types of recruiting companies out there. There's a contingency recruiter, and then there's a retained recruiter. Most people may have heard of retained recruiters like Korn Ferry and big companies like that seek out CEOs and VPs, higher level. And then there's contingency recruiters that find everybody else in between. The beauty of being a contingency recruiter is good and bad. We're truly what used to be coined a headhunter. As a contingency recruiter, you're not paid $1 unless you find somebody they want to hire, they hire them, and they stay there. So it's probably one of the few professions where you only get paid for producing and doing your job correctly.
I see. So the other type of recruiter is basically looking for bigger companies to attach to?
Yeah, a retained search firm might find C-suite executives.
Okay.
And they're paid up front to go and do that.
Okay, I see.
So there's less risk because they're getting paid to find said person.
I see the difference. Okay.
But what we do and what I did at my former company was specialize in a little niche, related to marketing. Obviously, marketing is not a little niche, but they had a unique little piece. I remember there was one woman that worked there that specialized in market research, which I had really never heard of, certainly when I graduated college. And there's a whole industry around market research, which is changed and growing today. And people think about the internet and data, and that's what it is, looking at facts, figures, data, information, behavior to decide how to market your product or service. And those are the people that we typically work with, those marketing research, analytic people, and then everybody tied to that industry, such as, sales and marketing people, things like that.
I see. So what does your typical client look like, and why specifically would they hire someone like yourself rather than go do it them DIY?
Right. So most companies do attempt to do it themselves. And it's interesting. Every time there's a new thing out there, back in the day, it was Monster, and it's LinkedIn. That was always said the thing that was going to eliminate recruiters. But ultimately, those are just tools to help everyone access and communicate better. Our typical clients are small to mid-sized companies that, number one, don't have the time or the effort or the knowledge to be able to go and seek out said individuals or have a dedicated HR recruiting professional. And then we have massive firms like Visa, for example, who you'd think, well, why would they need a recruiter? But they're so big and cumbersome, they get in their own way. They need, especially with these specialty positions, somebody to go and find somebody.
Right. How do you define small?
I mean, I work with companies 5, 10 people up to 50 to 100. That's probably a common factor.
Okay.
Like a company we do a lot of work with right now only has about 20 employees.
Yeah. Well, from my own experience, as I mentioned earlier, we just got through hiring a couple team members. I used one of those online platforms, and I think this is going to be a phenomenal episode and very valuable to the entrepreneurs. And I'm actually interested myself because it was a painful experience going through the hiring process. And so that's why I was asking, what does small mean to you? Because there's a lot of listeners out there that probably have, a handful of team members that probably don't have a lot of excess capacity from an owner's standpoint to find top talent. So I'm hoping today that you'll be able to shine some light on that, give us some tips and tricks. So before we get into the tips and tricks, let's talk about mistakes. And I'm sure that we probably stepped in a couple of these potholes ourselves. What are some of the common mistakes that you see business owners make from that hiring process?
As a quick overview on the mistakes, I would say the first mistake that most employers make are they are ultra concerned about what they want and the list of items, and they look at the candidate as the person that's vying for their job. Especially in this marketplace, you have to sell why somebody wants to work for you. So I tell everybody, put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand if you were on that other side of the desk, what would you want to hear that would attract you to that company? And don't just focus on, do you do these things that I want you to do or not? Because that will eliminate people. The other thing is getting stuck on particular salaries. A lot of people have a salary in mind, and then they'll have skill sets that don't match that salary. So look for the skill set, then find out what somebody's earning, and that will give you an idea of who you can actually hire based upon your budget.
I see. So, those are common mistakes. And I think that I know for a fact that we've over the years have made those same mistakes. And I think having that perspective of the candidate is something that, to be honest, we lacked in several of the hires or the periods of time that we were looking to hire someone. And that's not only in the hiring process, but anything that you do in life is you need to take the other side of the table, their perspective, and, what are they looking for? Why do they want to, work for your firm? Because as you mentioned, we're in a period of time where the labor market is very tight. People aren't just knocking on your door looking for work. They're most likely already employed somewhere else and they're comfortable, but maybe they're kind of looking for something else. So you really need to have a very good offer for them, a reason why they should move, because like I said, they're probably already employed. At this point in the cycle of the economy, we don't have a lot of idle workers. Would you agree with that?
That's 100% accurate. So it's a matter of changing the process of the standard. I advertise a job, here's my title, and here's what I want, without describing who your company is, and make it like anything in media today, grab that person's eye or attention to say, boy, Lake Hills Wealth Management sounds really unique and interesting. What is this job? That's the way all hires should start is, wow, this company looks interesting. What is this job? Not the other way around.
Yes. I like that. That's very good advice. And then also, on the salary is the same thing. So I think those are two common mistakes. I've made them myself. I'm sure other listeners have as well. So from your perspectives, what is the most common way most entrepreneurs hire? What's that process look like?
So traditionally, most employers hire by just advertising. That's what everybody does if you're on the employment side. And running ads, the issue is, I tell employers all the time, if you look at the universe of people that you could hire, that's 100% of those people, maybe 20% of them are going to see your ad. And of those 20%, I can guarantee at least half of those people have nothing, no skills related to doing your job, as we were talking earlier about you getting resumes that don't fit whatsoever. So then through your ad, at best, you're going to see 10% of the audience that you could hire. Does that sound like a good way to find the best talent for your company?
No, and it sounds too familiar because that's exactly what the issues that I had when hiring. I used, like I mentioned before, an online outlet, right? Placed an ad. I thought I actually spent a lot of time thinking about specifically what I wanted. And I thought that was going to yield me, and then some other filters that some of these online platforms have that try to mitigate the issue of throwing spaghetti at the wall, if you will, where you get someone that just says, "Oh, that looks interesting," or "I want to make that salary," and just apply, right? And hope and pray that they get it. And then I was spending hours basically combing through resumes or applications of someone that had no experience. When I put in the posting, you must have experience, you must possess these skills. And it was like, did they really think that they would have an opportunity? And so it just wastes so much time. And I know that there's, like I said, there's ways that some of these online outlets use algorithms and filters and things like that. But in my experience, it still was a very, very time consuming and not pleasurable process.
Yes. And don't let me lead you down the wrong path. You need to do many things to hire somebody, and running an ad is one of them. We run ads, okay? And the use and the amount of people that we get from an ad, the amount of time that I spend, I always struggle with because it's a massive waste of time. But occasionally you get a gem in there. But the way we use ads is we will see somebody who can't do the job, but they may have some general skills, and it highlights that maybe their company, something is going on. So therefore I can target that company and find other people who can do the job within that company. That's the way lots of times we'll use an ad.
I see. You're using it in a way that most people aren't using it. That's smart.
And also, I just want to bring up this point. Remember, as a recruiter, I have many jobs and many different companies I'm working with. So even if that said person applies and they're not right for that job, but they have some of those skill sets, I may be able to use them down the road, versus you would not be able to use them.
Right. Because you have a lot of connections that myself or most employers aren't going to have. I mean, so you've got a steady flow of good candidates that are coming through, right? And like you said, this person may not be good for this position, but hey, they are a really good fit for this company over here. So I think that's huge. So we've talked about, mistakes, pitfalls, what not to do, and what's common as far as the process employers are doing. What would you suggest entrepreneurs do or employers do? How should they hire?
That's a great question. So what I would suggest is the first thing I would tell every employer to do is to write a job description. And most people do have a job description, but they'll just pull out an old one. What I tell them to do is go over that and read that job description and break it down to a description. The description should be about your company and why it's unique or different and interesting. Then break it down to your responsibilities that this person are going to be conducting, because that can be the career advancement that somebody's looking for. And then last would be your requirements, that they have to have these minimum of things to be considered, so you can talk to them about that. So once you clean that up, then what you want to do is you can post an ad. Make sure, number one, you have a career section on your website where you have said opportunity. And then you should go out to your existing network where you can direct people to it and say, hey, does anybody know anybody like this in your current community? Then, of course, post it on, I would suggest, social media sites such as LinkedIn, for example. I like, because it's more business centered than anything.
Right.
And then from there, within a LinkedIn or other search engines, I'm just leaning on LinkedIn because we use that one a lot. You can target people that do the same job at another company. And they're fairly easy to find, especially these days. You just put in what your title is, if it's a common title, in your geographical area with an industry, you're going to have a whole list of potential candidates. So then you have to decide, what is your message going to be to that said candidate to get them to interact with you. And if you reach out to them and just say, I have a job, are you interested? No, they're working somewhere. You have to have some unique approach. And the best way I've found is to ask that person to connect with you along the basis that you're in the same industry and you'd love to connect. You're always looking for good people, and then bring up something positive that you saw on their profile that you liked. People like to be liked.
Right.
So if I see your profile and say, Jack, I mean, honestly, I see that you're doing X, and that's great. We would love for people like that. And your hair looks fantastic in this photo. It's funny. It's unique. It's not this boilerplate message. Somebody goes, it's kind of funny, and we'll connect with you, and you can have a dialogue. Whether that person is interested or not interested, you've made a connection within your own industry vertical.
Right. And you've got their attention because you said something different.
Right.
You know, it's the purple cow. So I got a question on the job description. I did spend a lot of time on that. Do you find that, so you have the job description and maybe some of the task or duties that person be responsible for. Do you suggest that the employer or the entrepreneur get really specific and have a long list? Or do you feel like less is more?
Traditionally, I see in job descriptions, there'll be an equal number of responsibilities versus requirements, probably more responsibilities than requirements. I think your requirements have to be targeted, but loose enough. So for example, I am working on a search right now where they said they wanted somebody with 7+ years experience. Then they changed their mind and said, well, maybe they'll consider somebody more junior. So if you pick a number in between and say like 5+ years experience, and then specific about what they need to have done. In this instance, they have to have done market research. And if you haven't done survey market research, you're not going to be a fit for this job. But that way people can interpret and understand. The biggest thing you have to be careful of is if you're too specific, candidates self-eliminate all the time. They will self-eliminate based upon your title and based upon your requirements, saying that they'll decide the job is either too junior or too senior, or they don't like your title. I just had a conversation yesterday with a client who admitted that their titles were really were too conservative, was her word, for what they were hiring for. So for example, they wanted to hire somebody and they had in their title the word analyst. And this person is making over $120,000 a year. That would be a director somewhere else. But they were afraid to use the title of director because people would think it was be managing others. So thinking about what your title and making a title descriptive is important. And also picking standard ones that are in the industry.
I never thought about that, but that's so true. Again, it's taking the perspective of the candidate. And a lot of times we have what's called the imposter syndrome, where we discredit our own skills sometimes. And I could imagine that list of tasks and responsibilities may be overwhelming to some people and may, like you said, self-eliminate. So that's awesome. Let's talk about social media. I know you mentioned LinkedIn already. You know, social media is a very powerful platform, even for entrepreneurs, but everyone is using it and everyone is vying for our attention. I mean, we have emails, calls, text messaging, and now social media. So in what ways can employers use social media to not just hire, but make high quality hires?
That's a great question. So that is the problem. And it's interesting. One of the complaints I have, for example, with LinkedIn that I used to like was LinkedIn in the news stream. When you click on it, was all about work or business.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's all kinds of nonsense in there. Everybody wants to post about somebody saving some animal or
Politics.
something. And you're like, can that please just be on Facebook or somewhere else? So the best way to do it is by you connecting to individuals within your industry or your focus area, because those individuals will then be prompted to see your message if they're following your company. So the best thing you can do is create your own profile, for example, on LinkedIn about your company, and then provide content on there. And believe it or not, we are not as complicated or as smart as we think we are. People like pictures. And if you have a unique picture and a headline that relates to your subject, that's important. And less is more. So if you have some subject you want to discuss, a nice picture that relates to it with one headline, a couple of quick bullets that then lead somebody to have a conversation or connect with you is the best way to do it.
That's really good tips. So is there any other platforms that you would suggest, or maybe specifically websites that you like to use as part of the hiring process, or you would suggest?
Most of this is going to be, you want to make sure that whatever social media posts you have are aligned with your own website. So making sure that that's constantly up to date with information is important. It depends on what your product or your business is. Facebook may be a fabulous place to put things that are business to consumer related, business to business. I would stick with LinkedIn. And I've heard this from many people. There's so many platforms. You have to pick the platform that you think is unique for you and your audience. If you try and cover all the platforms, it's not going to work. So for you trying to be on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, you're not doing yourself a service. Pick one and concentrate and dominate on that particular social media outlet that seems to be the one that's most appropriate for your audience.
So have you, because you mentioned Facebook, and I have seen, I don't know how successful, but entrepreneurs post on there trying to get someone in their network to maybe make a recommendation for someone. Do you find that a lot of people even use Facebook? Because I know LinkedIn is sort of the king on social media as far as the professional network.
It's interesting. I've tried to use Facebook and I've seen a few things on Facebook. And honestly, with all Facebook's information, I still find it amazing that their search tool is so pathetic. It's literally one line and you type in somebody's name and you have a few filters. It's very poor. It does amaze me that they don't have a platform that could tie in so you could specifically target those individuals. Just like when you go on Facebook and you were looking at the latest widget and it now appears in your news stream. Well, based on the information you put in as your title, your company, your location, I would like to think they would then serve up the ad of the job that you're looking for, but they haven't seemed to figure that out.
I want to go back to something else that you said, which was making sure that not only that you've tidied up your LinkedIn and that you've spent time on the job description requirements and tasks, but also that you mirrored that on your website. What's the importance of that? Because I'll be honest, I have not done that.
So what'll happen is if I'm a candidate and I see said job, the first thing somebody's going to do is, number one, if you post it and you put your profile on there, they're going to want to look at who are you.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other thing I forgot to mention is your personal profile should be updated. Most people do it once and they never go back to it. You should constantly be looking at that, put an updated photo. If you have some new information to put on there, because that's where someone will go, who's this Jack guy?
Right.
And the next step from there is, okay, well, this sounds interesting. What is Lake Hills Wealth Management, for example? That leads them to your website. If your website is old and you don't have the same things related, or you're not promoting your products, your services, and you don't have a career page that's highlighting said job and maybe why it's unique or different, and that's where you could put other content, pictures about your firm or a video about your firm, you're going to have a disconnect.
So you have to have continuity between all the different, your website, the different social media outlets, and you're suggesting that the company LinkedIn page is well designed.
Yes.
And that not only that, but your personal page as well, right?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that a lot of times the corporate page or your company page, is the neglected one, or vice versa. Like you mentioned, that they've spent a lot of time building out that page, and then when the candidate goes to the individual, it's like that photo hasn't been updated since the inception of LinkedIn, and there's nothing relevant there. And if you're saying that you're at the cutting edge of, let's say you're making widgets and this widget is the cutting edge of this industry, but yet when I go to your website, there's nothing about it, I could see how someone might get turned off by that.
Now, and a quick aside, just to flip the switch again, talking about both sides of the fence, same thing goes with any of your listeners who are candidates who may be looking. I get it all the time where a candidate sends me a resume And the resume looks great and talks about all kinds of various skills. And then I go to their LinkedIn profile, which is what every employer, almost every employer goes to do. And if that's not updated and in sync, you're going to have a disconnect. And I've also seen vice versa, where somebody has an amazing LinkedIn profile and it does not match with their resume. So having those things tied together is important.
Do you recommend, speaking of that, do you recommend entrepreneurs or employers to go to their personal Facebook, Instagram?
It's interesting because I have a friend of mine who's currently looking to hire somebody, and I made that suggestion to get a sense of who that person is. So, for example, you may present yourself in one way on LinkedIn or in a professional site like that, and you may present yourself differently on Facebook. And that's not a bad thing. You are a different person in work than you are sometimes in your personal life, but that will give somebody a window into who are you hiring. If every picture on that Facebook page is them just being some drunkard at every bar in town every weekend, you're like, that's my employee who's showing up on Monday morning. Is that who I really want to hire?
Right, because there is a little bit of projecting going on the more professional sites, and then you get a little bit more relaxed into who you are, because Facebook and Instagram and things like that, outlets like that, are more for your friends. But I know that is something that I've had a conversation with other entrepreneurs. I've talked to Jason about that, because we look at them all. Good, bad, or ugly. I think you should look at those. If they've got nothing against it, but if they've got rainbow hair, and to your point, if there are pictures in front of bars and things like that, that may or may not be a good fit for you, depending on your company. So that's good advice. Okay, so after you've got the ideal candidate to respond, let's say you've got that check, how do you suggest employers move through the next phase, which I would argue is long and time-consuming hiring process? For most people, it is, because there's sometimes 3 or 4 or even more different contacts there. So how do you suggest employers do that?
That's a great question. So the number one complaint by anybody who's ever looked for a job is the length of the interview process. And if you do a little planning as an employer and you have a plan of attack, and I ask all employers that I work with, what's your interview process? And everyone has an interview process in their mind, but it usually falls short on reality of getting it done in a timeline. So you have to use all the technology that we have today to make it stay within that timeline. So for example, when you get said resume or you talk to this person, if the resume looks good, move quickly, respond to that person, send them a quick email or a message. Hey, I got this and I'm reviewing it. It looks interesting. Communication is paramount. If the candidate doesn't feel that there's interest, why are they going to be interested? They will lose interest in the process. So as you first have an interview with somebody and somebody has a good conversation with you and it's positive, they're excited. They're excited about the next step. If that first interview takes 2 weeks from now, they're already losing interest. Remember, there's lots of distractions in this world, like their current job, their current task, or maybe a recruiter calling them about another job. And now, who was Jack again? I remember, but what? And then you go in and you have an in-person interview, and that goes well. If it's just with one person, remember, when somebody goes to interview with you, that's a huge amount of time out of their day to get themselves prepared, to go, to meet with you, even if it's for an hour, and then to leave and go back to their job. That's a huge ask of somebody. So make sure you value their time and make sure you use it appropriately to have as many people talk to them as possible. Make sure you have a very productive conversation. The way to do that is have questions prepared. Have the resume with you so you can walk through it and make sure you've highlighted anything that you really want to focus on and ask about. Then if that goes well, great. If it doesn't, let them know quickly, hey, this was great. I don't think this one's exactly right for you, so you don't leave them lingering. If you are interested, make sure that you stay in touch with them, even if it takes some time to round up your other partners to be able to interview them, that you're interested. Jimmy's just out of the office right now. We want to see you. What's your schedule? if you get something scheduled, even if it's farther out in a timeline and they know that's coming, that shows that you care about their time because their time is as valuable as yours.
So humility, because a lot of times it's sort of like dating. I guess it sounds like, right?
Very much so.
You have this ego that, hey, everyone wants to go on a date with me or everyone wants to work for my firm. And so it's sort of like this game where you don't want to, it's like the 3-day rule. You don't want to contact them too early because you don't want to let them know that you're really interested in them. I'm sure there's entrepreneurs out there that have felt that way. And I think that is really good perspective that you're giving is, again, take it from their side of the equation. And let's say they came in, they spent all the time with you and went through the process and they felt like, wow, this is a really good firm. This is a good fit. And you thought so too, but you didn't let them know. And now what are they thinking? They're thinking it went terrible. Maybe they don't want me. And maybe now this is a dead end. I'm going to go somewhere else. I think that's great. So really, and especially in this tight market, I think you have to make sure that you've mapped out that process. If you've got 5 people or whatever your process is for interviewing, you better have it mapped out and you have to move quickly. I know some of my clients have complained about they've gone through this process. They found the right candidate like you're talking about, and they had a couple other interviews. And then by the time they had their own decision-making process internally, whether that was, going through their measuring that person against immutable laws or whatever their moral compass was. And then by the time they got back to the candidate, sorry, I've already taken another position.
Yes. And I certainly see that, especially now in this marketplace. So that's, believe it or not, most of my job is not finding said candidate. It's what I call moving them through the process and communicating with the candidate and the employer and chasing everybody down to keep the connection going. So for example, what you were talking about as far as somebody having already accepted another offer. What happened was I guarantee that employer never communicated to that candidate of what their process was as it was happening so that they felt they were still engaged. If they were, that candidate would say, hey, listen, I know you guys are meeting next Thursday. I've had a final interview with another place and they're telling me they're going to make me an offer Friday, but I'm really interested in you guys. So that way you would then be able to speed up your process, but you wouldn't know that if you don't keep a communication, a dialogue. So what we do is, for example, for a recruiter, if say I said somebody to you, Jack, and you interviewed them, I give it 24 hours and I ask you, what'd you think? What'd you like? What you didn't like? And I ask the candidate the same thing. And lots of times there may be question marks that come up. The candidate asked a bunch of things, but he forgot to ask about this or doesn't know about this, or you forgot to ask something. So then I can get those answers quickly. You don't have to have another interview. So that way you can understand this person does or does not fit.
That perspective, I've never thought about it that way. But again, I use the analogy of dating, but it's like hiring a dating coach, right? And that information can be pivotal on finding the right person or not. And especially in this case, we're talking about finding the right candidate. You're the intermediary, right? You have the ability to step on both sides of the fence and say, hey, candidate, how did you think this went? And they tell you, hey, I loved it. And then you can kind of go back after 24 hours or whatever and go to the employer. How did it go? So I never thought about that dynamic. And I can see how you and your firm, someone like you, could be instrumental in shortcutting this process. And not only that, but finding the right person, which is key, because how much energy, time, and money goes into hiring just to have them come in. And then ideally either they weren't a good fit or your company wasn't a good, depending on what side of the equation, it wasn't a good fit. And they leave 2 months later.
Right. That's the worst case scenario. So we spend an inordinate amount of time doing that. A couple of things you brought up I wanted to highlight were the time. Okay. So here's one thing that I constantly preach that I don't think people realize, especially employers, when they decide they want to hire, they need to hire them yesterday. So the interview process from a search standpoint, and I consider myself an expert and very, very efficient, okay, is 60 days. From the time you tell me you want to hire said person to the time that person could remotely show up at your doorstep for work would be 60 days, the fastest. The reason being, it's going to take 10 days to 2 weeks to find said person and have them show interest. Then to communicate with them, talk to them, screen, get their updated resume, then to set an interview. We're now in week, 3?
Mm-hmm.
So you do a phone interview. Well, that went well. Now we're going to set up an in-person interview. And let's pretend you're on point and you have an in-person interview the following week. We're on week 4, 5 now?
Yep.
That goes well. Great. Now you want Jason to meet them. Well, that's going to be next week. But you know what? Jason's traveling, so it's going to be the following week. Next thing you know, we haven't even made an offer. You like the guy, then you have to make an offer. Let's say that takes another week to prepare the offer. You present it. Then the candidate's going to sit on that offer for a weekend or a week to make a decision he don't know. Then he accepts. Then that person has to give 2 weeks notice. You see how this thing winds out, and suddenly 3 months out, you're like, oh my God, we needed to hire this person yesterday. And now we're 3 months or 2 months into it and we're dying with work. And therefore other employers are getting pressured and you lose employees.
I had that same experience because when we talked about making a hire, I was under the impression that this was going to be a fast process because we don't do a whole lot of hiring. And it was not, because exactly, it's like you were telling my story. I mean, that's the same experience that I had. So I guess the moral of that story is you need time, right? You can't say, I need to have somebody by next week.
Yes.
You might have someone, but it may not be the right person. You may have to go through the process again.
Let's also consider that, let's say you find that said person next week. And I have had that where I've had somebody that I know of or applied to an ad that actually is right. They're likely to have a job, or even if they don't have a job, they're not going to be able to start next week. And if you get your interviews done in 2 weeks and they need a week to do something, you're still at a month, even if that person is unemployed.
Right.
So the other thing I want to hone in on, because I think it's important that employers think, and I'm going to emphasize think, that they have interest in their job if they have a volume. Okay. So if you advertise a job and you, for example, use that online platform and you got 30 resumes in there, you're like, wow, this is great. We have a lot of interest in our job. Yes, you have a lot of interest from people that can't do your job. 98% of them, right?
Yep, I would agree with that.
So don't get wooed by this idea that the fact that you have lots of interest means that you have candidates for your job. Because I hear that from employers all the time when I approach them about our services. Oh, we're all set. We have lots of candidates. Then I ask, how many of those candidates did they actually interview or talk to? And usually that number drops dramatically.
You had a lot of suspects.
So typically when we do a search, for example, I am contacting, and I'm extremely targeted. Okay. I'm going to contact probably 100 to 125 people to shake loose maybe 5 to 10 candidates. And of those, let's say 10 candidates that show interest, I'm going to bring it down to about 3 to 5 that can actually do the job, that fit, then present them to you. And probably half of those people, you're going to say they don't fit or something happens with them. So that's the volume that has to go into it. So when you get said candidate, you should move quickly. And also keep in mind, this is the same analogy that they use in real estate. If you see the house that looks good and it's the first house you looked at, don't think you got to go look at 50 more houses because that house will be gone.
FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yes, very true.
Yeah, that's also very good advice. And I can say that, I'm not experienced in the hiring process, and that was exactly what happened in our case. We received a whole lot of interest, but when you start diving in, most of those people, there was probably only 1 or 2%, like you said, they were actually qualified and that we were interested in. So I could see how someone like yourself could come in and save the employer a ton of time and money and heartache, because that process of filtering, calling, setting it just takes a lot of time. So let's say we found the ideal candidate, and this is the final but also really important process, which is the offer. So, how should employers make an offer that gets accepted?
That's a great question and extremely important. After we've talked about all these processes and things to do, the offer makes or breaks thing. And the frustrating thing on my end is I've seen employers time and time again lose the candidate they want to hire because of a poor offer. And this goes back to, again, understanding and communication. So what we do as recruiters, which is always tricky sometimes as an employer, is you'll have a general salary range you're working on that the candidate usually has some semblance of what it is. What you need to understand is, what is that person making and what are their salary expectations? Now, there's certain laws in a few states these days, and it's growing, where an employer is not allowed to ask what you make because they don't want employers hiring people based upon their salary. But that's some measure of understanding. So what I've found is you need to understand somebody's salary expectation and understand that most candidates that I've dealt with, this is almost so accurate, it's amazing. If you tell me your salary expectation is X, I can take 20 to 25% off that number. That's what you're earning. That's an unrealistic number. Meaning, if you stay in your current job, you're going to get a 2 to 3% raise.
Right.
So for you to expect some new employer to pay you 25% more than you're making now, that's not going to happen. You're going to be out of what the common pay is for that job. And vice versa. Most employers that I deal with, they won't pay anybody anything. They want to sell them on how it's so great to work there and they're going to get a free t-shirt. Why don't they want to come work there because you have a job and it's amazing? That's not the case. That person, the rule of thumb used to be, at a minimum, you have to offer them 10% more than they're earning now, based upon the idea that if they have a 3 to 5% raise in their current job, you have to at least double it to make them consider it.
Right.
What I've found out of all those numbers is 15% is the magic number. So if I knew you were earning X, or I could guesstimate you were earning X, 15% over that is a reasonable increase. Now, those numbers can swing a little bit lower, a little bit higher, depending upon what that person's other compensation factors are.
So that brings up another point, because when you have a tight labor market, one of the tactics is, and I like your input on this, is employees know that I can make more, in most cases 10, 15, 20% more by going to another shop, another employer. How, obviously you got to make them happy, right? Because otherwise they're just going to keep jumping ship. What do you think is the average time employees stay at a firm? It used to be like, I just remember the IBM days, because I had early in my career, I had a lot of IBM clients, and that was their first job out of college, and that's where they retired. That's no more.
Right.
I think the average of what I've seen is 2 to 3 years. I mean, what is your experience?
I would agree. I'd say 3 to 5 years maximum is what I've seen. And that length of time has changed based on economic factors, in the sense of, you go back to the financial crisis and what was occurring. People stayed at jobs longer than they should have. And I say should have in the sense that they just came in doing the same thing and not growing, not learning. And that builds frustration. You get an employee who's not learning or growing. So the biggest thing that you can do as an employer is find ways and ask that employee what else they want to do, what are the responsibilities they want to take on. That's what drives people. Most employers think money drives people. It's really not. That is certainly a portion of it, but a portion of it is feeling valued, that they're doing something worthy of note, that they're learning, they're growing. If you go in and do the same thing every day, you're going to get bored.
Yeah, that's critical, because money is it's probably more of a short-term influencer or motivator, but long-term, it's a terrible one, because if they come in and they've got a terrible culture, and that person's a terrible person for the company's culture, vice versa, it's not going to be good for either party. So just to mirror what you were saying on the salary, is that you really need to do your homework on that and make sure that when you get to the dance, so to speak, that last phase of actually the offer, that you've done some homework on there and that you make an adequate offer to that candidate so you don't have to go through the process again.
Right. So when you get right down to brass tacks and making an offer, make sure it's just not a number that you've come up with that suits your needs. If you don't understand that you have that person in front of you, and I have these all the time, usually you'll find the issue is a problem with more junior candidates. They'll have this grandiose idea that they have 2 years experience. Of course, they need to get paid $90,000 a year.
Is there a website or somewhere you go to kind of see general guidelines on salary for different positions?
There's a few out there, none that I would recommend, because the problem is it's information that is not very concrete. I just haven't found any that are very successful. You should know what a job pays within your industry generally. And then when you start talking to candidates is the best way to do it. What we do, for example, every year we do an actual survey and we ask people, what do you make? What's your base? What's your other compensation? What are your salary expectations to get a real idea of an actual number? That's hard to do. You'd think there'd be a website out there that does it, but they're not very good.
I see. So this has been very valuable. I've learned a whole lot myself, and I know that this will be very useful and always timely, of course, because as a business grows, we're always hiring. And of course, you do have some turnover there because like we mentioned, most employees just aren't staying at their employers as long as they used to, especially in the tight market. But as we wrap up the interview, I'm always excited to get to the rapid fire session because it's a way that I get to learn a little bit more from the personal aspect of the guest. And so the first question I have for you is, how do you keep your edge? I find that we always have to do something to, especially to be good at what we do. We have to constantly be learning to sharpen the axe, so to speak. So what are you doing?
That's a great question. I think if you could just get stuck, which can happen in just your job, it's not good. It's always good to read, listen to podcasts about different things and subjects. And also our lives, certainly in America, are behind a desk in an office. So I make a real effort of doing the opposite of that in my personal life. Like to work out, play golf, be outside, do any kind of other activity that doesn't require me to sit down behind a desk.
Yeah, that's key. So so far in life, who's been the most impactful on your life?
That's a great question. And I thought of a few people that I mentioned, some humorous, but as opposed to picking a specific person, I'd say a couple of things. Anyone who tells me I can't do something has probably had a great influence on my life. Because those individuals I like to prove wrong.
Yeah.
And my kids I've learned a ton from.
That's awesome. Yeah, I agree with you. Whenever someone says you can't do that, boy, it's like just fire within you. It's fuel. I love it. You use it. So if you could recommend one book or one resource to the entrepreneurial community, what would it be?
I thought about that too. I came up with two. I couldn't come up with just one. There was two that in recent times I've read. So one that I read was recommended to me by a friend of mine was a book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss.
Love that book.
And I mean, I should probably read it again, quite frankly. It's an amazing perspective on how to negotiate and what people's perspectives are. And again, it goes back to the idea of putting yourself in their shoes. Great book. And then the other one is Jocko Willenick, who's a Navy SEAL guy, has his podcast, and he has that book called Extreme Ownership. And I think if more people took ownership for their own actions or why things were happening, as opposed to blaming others, they would advance their businesses.
I'm gonna have to read his book. I've heard of him. I've seen him on a couple other podcasts as well. So I'll put that in the show notes. So not only for myself, but for the listeners. So what do you do? What do you like to do in your free time? You mentioned golf.
Yep. I wish I played more, but a solid twice a month if I'm lucky these days. But I get up most mornings and work out to just kind of clear my mind. In the evenings, at least once a week, I play ice hockey. And I like to do fun things. My business is so business-like that I like to design T-shirts and send them to my candidates and clients, and just cool, soft T-shirts, just something creative to do that ties in with the business, but is enjoyable.
Awesome. All right. So financial freedom, it means different things to different people. For us, it means having enough assets or income sources to where we're making work optional. That's what it is for Lake Hills Wealth Management. And that is our motive for each and every one of our clients. What does financial freedom mean to you?
I wish that I could be more like you guys. Let's put it that way. But consistent cash flow and savings is important so that way you can make business decisions not based completely on where you are financially is probably the most important thing. One of your podcasts I wanted to bring up was, I think it was number 4 that you and Jason had talked about, and it really hit home to me. It was such a simple process of taking 20% of what comes in and putting that into savings and living off 70% of what you earn. And that's something that I'm implementing this year. I've attempted it over the past years, not successfully, but it's very easy if you pull it down. Every time I get a check, I'm going to take 20%, put it into savings. That way, suddenly you look around in a couple of months, you're like, wow, I have a bunch of money. Where did that come from?
It adds up quick. Yeah, you get in that habit of doing it, and then it just becomes automatic, and you're really setting the game up to win. Thanks for mentioning that. So how does Phil Reeve want to be remembered? I think the legacy question is always interesting for me.
Yeah, that's a really hard question. It makes me kind of think of your obituary, as it were, which nobody wants to talk about. But I'd like to be remembered as, what I'd like to reflect and be, which is honest, hardworking, dedicated, and driven to help others be better. That's what I get a real charge out of is, for example, doing this podcast. I'm doing this because I really would love for somebody to learn from it and do better because of it.
Yeah, I agree. I could see your passion and what you do. I envious of how easy you making videos. There's a lot of really good content on your website, which I'd love to point the listeners to. So how do you suggest listeners, if they have questions or maybe if they want to learn more about what your firm can do for them, how should they contact you?
The easiest way, of course, is to go to our website, which is reevejobs.com. That's REEVEJOBS.com. And one thing that you did mention that I wanted to was when you go and visit there, because I know you're going to, is look at a job video that I make. And that's something you can use in your own hiring process where you just shoot a little video about who it is that you are, what your company is, and what you're looking for. People want to know who you are, not just a piece of paper with requirements and what you want in a job description. If you can add that visual where somebody meets you, it's very important. But reevejobs.com. We're right here in Austin. You can also reach us at 203-968-2773. I know it's a Connecticut number, but that's one we've had forever. So
we've adopted him as a Texan.
Yes.
Yeah. Visit Phil and his company and his associates there at Reeve Associates. They are a wonderful resource if you're looking to hire someone, obviously not tomorrow, but in the near future. I think that the content you put out is phenomenal. The advice that you've given here is really pragmatic. Before we go, I want to remind listeners that we welcome questions. Maybe it's a question for Phil or Jason, prior guest. So what I recommend is either visit one of our social media outlets, maybe it's Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, etc. Or you could go to profitstowealth.com/contact and submit a question there. Phil, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and the contribution that you've made to our community, and I look forward to doing it again.
Perfect. Thanks for the time. Really appreciate it, Jack. Always good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Take care.
That's all for this episode of Profits to Wealth. But we have more resources available to you on our website. Head over to profitstowealth.com and take our questionnaire to find out how we can provide you with a tailored approach to your entrepreneurial journey. It's available exclusively on profitstowealth.com. Until next time, we look forward to talking business, money,